while we're waiting for the screen to come to life, I will be selling this book today. No. So I think a good question to ask is, why is Jason doing a presentation on how to make a presentation? And I would tell you, it's not because I read a book on how to make a presentation, and certainly not because I make good presentation. It's actually because I used to make atrociously bad presentations, and so I'm kind of living proof that if you simply do a little bit of research, that you could improve dramatically. And so I'm going to use a lot of what I picked up from this book, and I also sort of reference some of the more successful presenters we have at our firm, demonstrating that they already intuitively do what is said here. And so let's see, let me just make sure So with that, I'm going to start with sort of the, this is a widely known observation, that is, in terms of audience response to a presentation, only 30% of that is actually influenced by the content of your presentation. The other 70% is actually influenced by the context. And what do I mean by that? I think the best illustration, and I'm sure this has occurred to some of you before, when you make a presentation, people seem to go, ah. And then if Ron makes the very same presentation, people seem to be super enthusiastic about it. Right? And you go, wait, I just said the same thing. Right? And that's what I mean by context versus content. And then we'll explain why that effect happens. All right, so first thing I want to start with is we're actually all really bad presenters. Many of you may not believe so, but I'll demonstrate that in a second. So the traditional advice on how to present effectively largely looks like this, right? It's like you got to have stage presence. You got to have this gravitas when you walk into a room. You got to enunciate so people understand what you're saying. The intonation, and of course, if you're Italian, I guess Swiss Italian would count as well. You got a lot of hand movement, and that's very, very helpful. And of course, they say, lock yourself in a closet and repeat, practice. And you tell your audience what you're going to say. You say it, and you tell them what you just said, and you say it again. So repetition seems to be useful. But what we actually now know, and notice and I'll hit on this point later on again. I'm going to say research at Stanford, right? So I'm going to give you some credibility. What they've discovered is delivery, presence, your ability to speak English fluently is completely uncorrelated with the effectiveness of the communication. So what I mean, so this is the research. So they got a bunch of MBA students, and they gave all these MBA students a very kind of simple 3-pagers to sort of rehearse for about 10, 15 minutes. And they asked them to present to other MBA students. And these presenters were graded. And not surprisingly, the native speakers got really good grades. The people who were just good presenters in the sense that they're interesting, they told a joke, and so on and so forth, got really high marks. And like foreign students got poor marks, so you're not surprised by that. But that's not it. What they then did was they waited 30 minutes and actually came back and then tested the audience on what did they actually remember from the presentation. And everyone got the same score. No one remembered a single thing that was actually presented. So most of us have this more naive experience of a presentation. So the guy was funny, he spoke good English, he didn't do anything awkward. And we thought, oh, that was a great presentation. But no, the point of communication is not entertainment. Right? The point of communication is you want something to be communicated. Someone has to remember what the heck you said, and hopefully that translates into action items. In Jeff's case, right, someone should give him some money at the end of the conversation. Otherwise, it really didn't matter. Right? And so, from that perspective, we're actually all really bad communicators. Whether you spoke good English, bad English, you tell a joke or not, most of us actually don't leave an impression and don't get people to do what we want them to do at the end of it. So what are the reasons for why we communicate really poorly? The first thing they identify is what's called a curse of knowledge. I'm going to do the following thing, and then you'll get a sense of what we mean by curse of knowledge. So I'm going to tap out one of the following three songs. Right? Happy Birthday, the national anthem. Actually, I only know two songs, so maybe just these two. All right, so, and then you have to tell me which one I'm tapping to, okay? Okay, and so if I tell you, and then you kind of start to try to hum in the back of your head, you'll get a sense of the tapping. But if I didn't tell you that, and I just sort of tap, most people would not be able to guess which song I'm tapping to. And so most of the communication, we assume a set of knowledge. And so it's like, okay, you know, happy birthday, or there's like this humming of the music in the background. But that's because that music is actually playing in the back of our head, or we communicate enough of that, so someone plays that in their head as well. So when you're tapping, they get a sense of what this is supposed to mean. In other situations, most of the time people just hear tapping, and they have no idea what this is supposed to mean because the other secondary or even primary information isn't provided with that. And so that's the curse of knowledge, which is when you have that hum that's already, the humming, that song already going on in your head, the tapping makes sense. Otherwise, it just sounds like Morse code. And this is the curse of knowledge, and that actually is a big problem for most of us, in the sense that we know a lot more than our audience. And without setting them up properly by telling them I'm tapping happy birthday or tapping the national anthem, people just hear taps, and they have no idea what you're trying to say. And that's because you have such a big information asymmetry advantage over the next guy that half the time you really don't know what you're saying. So another big problem in terms of poor communication is our preference for accuracy. We focus on accuracy over accessibility. Particularly the more knowledgeable you are, the bigger of an issue it is, right? If you try talking to, Vitali or Feifei, the different researchers, and you want them to communicate to you, it's like, tell me what is a factor. What you get back is some very detailed descriptions, and then maybe even talk about how the long-short portfolio is constructed. And frankly, if you didn't know very much finance, that description is completely useless, even though it might be very accurate and correct. And so again, as a presenter, when you fail to grasp what the other side of the conversation sort of understands as sort of baseline knowledge, you try to be more accurate than what can possibly be accessed, then you lose accessibility, which is really first-order importance in terms of communication. And so the emphasis of accuracy over accessibility is a problem. The other one is we create needless resistance. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes when you present, we start with this assumption. Someone does not believe me, and I need to convince them. So you engage into it like a debate. And what that energy draws forth is someone realizes this is a debate, and you're trying to convince them they need to be skeptical. Resistance comes up, and they start arguing with you, either in the audience, in the back of their mind, or outright arguing with you. And that's just foundationally unhelpful if you can avoid it. Another one is we overestimate people's attention span. And this is particularly hard for smarter people who were smart students before. Because as a smart student, you pride yourself with being able to keep track of lots of things, being able to sit through really boring, horrible lectures given by really unprepared and horrible professors. And so you just assume other people should behave like that. But that's not true at all. The average human being can keep 1 1/4 thought in their head at a time, and you give them another piece of information, and out goes the last piece you communicated. And then related to that, frankly, most of the time, your audiences don't care. Again, because we're good students in school, that never occurred to us that you could be in a situation where someone's telling you information and you don't care. And oftentimes, and especially if you TA'd or actually taught, you have this hubris of, I get to give someone a test, so of course they're going to care about what I'm telling them. But the fact of the matter is when Jeff presents something to the end client, right, he doesn't get to give them a test. They're perfectly happy to just tune them out or, play with their iPhone under the table. And so how do you keep people's attention? Because you don't get to give them an exam. Another mistake we often make, again, being more quantitatively oriented, we think numbers mean something. We think numbers are details, concrete, accurate, facts, and we tend to use numbers to argue stuff. But the fact matters, people don't actually understand numbers most of the time. You tell someone, wow, you have a 1 in 10 to the 16th chance of winning this. I mean, is that bigger than 1 to the 9th? Yeah, I know it's bigger, but by how much? So most people don't have a sense of numbers, actually, and we actually make the mistake of trying to make a point through numbers. We also use graphs inappropriately. I know the standard convention is a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's actually true if it's a picture of the landscape, of the Statue of Liberty, things that you already have an emotional attachment to, you understand it visually what it's supposed to communicate. That's not true when you plot a graph from Excel. Most people don't have any visceral attachment or natural intuition of a graph. And so oftentimes, if a graph needs 1,000 words to explain, that really doesn't do any good. Right? And so just understand the fact that you have a picture really doesn't solve the problem. It has to be something that people are connected to already. And you need to represent your information, if you want to use a graph, with a standard graph or picture that's already got a natural intuition or an emotional attachment to the underlying story you wish to tell. Okay, so with that, hopefully I've convinced you that you might have seen people who present well in the sense that they have great stage presence, they're kind of interesting, they have good pace, they have good, hand gestures, but frankly, that doesn't actually make for an effective presentation. So let's just start with this. We're all not very good. And to succeed, talent's actually not required at all. It helps, but it's not at all required. Like if you read the book by Malcolm Gladwell, it says talent only tells you one thing. Talent tells you what you're not going to be good at. Like if you're 6'8", it doesn't mean you'll be a talented basketball player. It means you're not going to be a talented gymnastic person. Right? If you're, so if you can, if you sort of understand that, the fact that you have better voice intonation does not in any way, shape, or form guarantee you'll be a great presenter. So, give you some sort of helpful tips from this book, and of course this is sort of summarizing a large number of research from the psychology department. So it's much more about understanding the audience, the psychology of thinking, remembering, of resistance, of emotional connectedness. And so that's going to be the focus of this presentation. And that's also where I got the title from. Success, I mean, I'm sure they worked really hard to try to come up with this acronym. But what it stands for is making the message simple, unexpected, credible, concrete, emotional, and then storytelling. So let's start with simplicity. Simplicity is the core essence in one breath. Now, any presentation, any message, there should be a core essence that you could tell within one breath. So what is simple? Now, a lot of people tend to think of simple as dumbing it down because my audience is not very bright or doesn't know very much. No, that's not at all what we mean by simple. Right? Simple is the core essence of your message. How do you state that without distraction? And so from that perspective, simple is very, very hard. In fact, why do some people give a complicated presentation with lots of sort of scattered, unrelated details? Oftentimes, it's because they don't know what is the core essence of the message. And so what you'll discover is, for really accomplished scientists, there's sort of a wisdom in which they communicate. They can make it really simple. That's actually incredibly hard because you have to really understand to know the core essence. Whereas like a more junior, a younger person in the field would tend to give lots of information that seems to distract. That's because they don't actually understand. So simple is actually quite very hard when you do that. And why is simplicity useful? Here's another research. It's kind of interesting. And when we hear a lot about less is more, and what do we actually mean by less is more? Well, this is a very much of a psychological effect. So the experiment that was done, students were given two choices. One is to stay in their dorm and study for an exam that's coming up in 2 weeks. And the other one is there's a Nobel Prize winner coming to give a very special lecture. And this is sort of a once-in-a-lifetime to sort of meet this Nobel Prize winner, listen to him talk. And, like 80-odd% of students would say, oh, I want to give that talk. I want to go and attend that talk. They run another questionnaire, and this time it's the first two choices plus a third one, which is there is a special performance by, a award-winning stage actor, and this, again, is limited engagement. And you imagine, oh, well, maybe some people, instead of going to the Nobel Prize-winning lecture, might want to go to this very, very special art performance. And no, what happens is that most people choose to just stay in their dorm and study. It seems completely irrational. What it shows, and this gets demonstrated over and over again, is if you're given a choice, and it's simple enough, you'll rationally make the right choice. So if you're given a useful piece of information, your brain will store that. If you're given 2 or 3, it starts to overwhelm you, and you don't even make choices anymore. That rationality goes away, and you just go back to the default, even if the default was a completely stupid choice in this case. Same thing. You think, oh, I gave someone a useful piece of information. While I'm at it, let me give him another useful piece of information. He'd be that much more appreciative. No. When you give that second piece of information, he actually throws both pieces of information away and go back to his old bias. And that's just actually how people behave. And if you don't understand that's how they behave, you wouldn't really understand what it means when they say less is more. And it completely has to do with just the way in which we store information. So if you already made a point, stop while you're ahead. Don't make another point. Chances are then you'll lose both. So in this case, in the presentation, really avoid having to make a 1-hour presentation because it's really boring to make one point over and over again in an hour presentation. So that's why they say it's sort of a 20-minute. That's why the TED Talk is sized maximally for 18 minutes, and most of the best speakers speaking at TED gets it done under 9, because all you can really communicate in any one setting effectively is one core message. And every slide, therefore, should make one point. Your slide is just not more interesting when you put 8, graphic, element on it. It just confuses people, overwhelms people if you just ignore that. So 1 point per slide. And if you need multiple slides to make a point, that's actually okay. And it's probably a good idea to use multiple points to make the central message, and just stick with that. And so, if I can use the monkey paper as sort of one of our more successful sort of present material that we presented, when you look at the monkey paper, a lot of people, that are more intellectually curious would say, well, the inverse portfolio, they have better return, or they have some residual alpha. Oh, that's kind of very interesting. You should kind of explain that and talk about that. And the thing is, you could, but I bet you if you start talking about that, people will completely forget the point of the paper, which is that deviating from cap weighting gives you better performance. Right? And so sort of that's just sort of an application when you think about that for your own presentation, for your own publication. So next point, unexpected. So the U in success. Like I say, our aim is not to entertain people. Our aim is to be remembered. And one of the best tricks to get remembered is to create something unexpected. Okay. The unexpected grabs attention, so I don't need to convince you of that. But the way in which it grabs attention is powerful because it engages the brain to start processing. Right? If you watch a bad movie, like everything is really predictable and there's no surprises, you could be easily entertained, but end of it, you wouldn't remember what the heck happened or what was the point. And so what you really need to do if you want people to remember is you need to engage the different aspects of the brain. So they need to process, they need to trigger sort of the visceral sensories to then give you maximal stickiness. But when we say unexpected, it doesn't mean to shock someone. I'll give you an example of what would be shocking but not terribly useful. So this is an ad during the Super Bowl a few years back, and there was a technology company, and their entire ad was a marching band walking into the Super Bowl stadium, and then like dinosaurs come out and ate them all. And so it was very shocking, but it was more gimmicky. Like it caused no association with the underlying brand, the products. It actually did nothing for them in terms of kind of the post commercial sort of target group survey. I just didn't do anything. So you got to think about in what way is that shock, that unexpectedness actually helpful? And to understand that, you want to focus on what's called creating a knowledge gap in the end audience. So what do we mean by knowledge gap? So what is understood is human beings are actually inherently curious, but in the following way. We're curious about things that we know, but just a little bit beyond that, so it stretches that. So, for example, what would be a knowledge gap to one would not be to another, and that's really, really useful, because what would be usefully unexpected doesn't apply across the board. An apple falling off of the apple tree, to all of us, would not be unexpected. We would learn nothing from it. We would get no curiosity from that. Only if you were Newton, you go, that is really unusual, and then discover gravity. So most of us were more at the level of Galileo dropping two objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and the heavier and the lighter one land at the same time. Now most of us would go, well, that's really unexpected. What's going on? And that's the kind of unexpectedness you want to create, because there's a common expectation that the heavy object would fall faster. When we don't see that, we're really shocked, and our brain starts to process what's happening. And then that creates a curiosity for which a high school teacher could teach gravity. And that's what you want to create in your presentation, is that degree of unexpectedness that just stretches the knowledge base of your audience, and that then triggers this curiosity. Right? So if you just give someone data and say, oh, this is data you don't know, people tune that out. People are not really all that interested in things they don't know or things that seem difficult. So to really engage that processing and the curiosities, you need to know what they know right now and then create that knowledge gap. And that's where you get the engagement that then drives interest. So again, so using the monkey paper as an example, the part that was unexpected, right? Because we could have talked about the math behind non-price weighting. We could have done all sorts of things, and to people that would just be information. It's not unexpected. It's information they didn't know, and if they wanted to know, maybe they would have found it interesting. So what actually created the knowledge gap that caused them to think, well, what is going on, is when you say, oh, smartbay.org, and most people go, great, that's interesting, maybe. But it's the inverse of that, also org. It's the, I can get some monkeys to throw darts and get the same effect. That then creates enough of that knowledge gap to then create that curiosity. And so again, in your presentation, think about what is the current knowledge base of your audience, and then what does it mean to then create that knowledge gap. And that would be the unexpected part of your presentation that will really drive engagement and curiosity. So moving on, so from our simplicity, unexpectedness, to credibility. And credibility is just about why should people trust what you say. And it's almost the first currency into a conversation. So what makes someone credible? What makes a presentation credible? Why should people spend the time to understand what you're saying? If you provide lots of details, that tends to give you more credibility. Of course, the credential of the person presenting it, or endorsement if you don't have the credential, going down to sort of other aspect that I'll cover very quickly. So credential, very easy to understand, right? It makes a huge difference whether Rob presents a slide deck versus, say, when Jeff presents a slide deck. And we pick on Jeff because that's what happens when you sit in the first row. Because Rob could say, and so on. Rob could say, I published 100 journal article papers. I was the editor of the FAJ. And so that credential allows him to say the very same thing that any one of us would say, and it would just be more believed. What's useful, though, however, is for you to understand that across different cultures, across different people, what is the proper credential can vary quite a bit. I think, broadly speaking, in the U.S., being an academic and what you say tends to actually carry greater weight than if you're academic in, I would say, Europe or in Asia. And that's because U.S. academics tend to be much more visible, and they tend to be much more successful financially than academic elsewhere, and they carry more of an influence. Whereas actually in, I think, Asia, tends to be executives of big firms who are much more influential than, say, well-known academics. So again, you got to understand from the perspective of your audience, what is the proper credential? And one thing I oftentimes make fun of is many of our audience that we speak to can't tell the difference between a Journal of Finance, an FAJ, or Journal of Vish. It's an inside joke. Journal of Vish was, well, you should ask a researcher and they'll tell you what Journal of Vish is. And so, again, you got to understand where your audience in terms of sophistication is and make sure you have the proper credential. But not all of us can have credential. Some of us will have more, and if you do, you're just lucky. And so oftentimes what we do is we play off of other people's credential by enlisting endorsement into our presentation. And so sometimes if you collaborate with someone else, even though it's mostly your intellectual property, but if you collaborate with someone who has that credibility, you can sort of leverage off of that in your own presentation. Of course, oftentimes we like to be the originator of an idea. It's actually a really, really, really bad thing. And that's because your audience can't tell whether that was original or not. They really can't. Most of your audience lack that sophistication, lack that understanding whether something is original, innovative, correct. And so it's actually oftentimes much better to cite a Eugene Fama, if you can, to cite a John Cochrane to make your point, than say, I wrote this paper and proved this point. Right? And so while you love to be an innovator, frankly, in a presentation, it doesn't really work as well as you're able to cite a higher authority. And then another one is sort of playing counter to an authority. And I think that's something what Research Affiliate succeeded at tremendously in our early years. We debated Vanguard, we debated Jack Bogle, we debated Burt Malkiel. And in that debate, what people associate you with is sort of the level of credibility of people you're debating with. Right? It wouldn't make any sense if Jack Bogle didn't see you as threatening or didn't see you as somehow credible to debate you. And so that's another thing that we use successfully. Something else, this is referred to as good enough for Frank Sinatra. He had a song where he says, you know, nothing but the very best is good enough for me. And that's the idea. Is if you have someone who's broadly viewed as a very high quality, you know, connoisseur of ideas, or someone who's incredibly critical, and if you're good enough for them, that oftentimes lends you that credibility. And so in this case, if you could say, you know, the thing is, we publish, and you often wonder, why the heck do we publish? 2-page fundamentals are so much more widely read because it's accessible, it's easy, it's not a 25-page journal article that is boring, painful, but yet we write 25-page long journal articles. Well, it's because many people can write 2-page fundamentals, and it doesn't give credibility. Even though no one reads your 25-page journal articles, the fact it got published in a journal and looks really hard, they say, well, that feels pretty credible. Right? Whatever that thing is saying, it's probably more likely to be true. And so what we tend to do is we put out 25-page boring journal articles, put it in the journal, and then we give people a 2-page version of the fundamental. But the credibility springs from the fact that it's been published. You know, we often use this other endorsement, you know, CalPERS buys Raffi. If it's good enough for CalPERS, it's got to be good enough for you dinky little $2 billion pension fund. Right. And something else, if you lack all the above, at least give details. Right? So when someone says, oh, on your last marketing trip, was there a lot of interest for low volatility investing? And you say, oh yeah, so spoke to a lot of people, they're all very interested in low volatility. That does not have credibility. If you say it this way, oh, in the last 2 weeks, spoke to a number of consultants, particularly when I was at Tower speaking with Phil Tyndall. He said he's been out with a couple clients, and a few of them are actually looking at the MSCI MinVar. They're thinking of de-risking away from their equity portfolio and use as a way of de-risking. Then that gives you much more credibility in concluding, and we really believe from that there's a strong interest for low volatility. So at least being able to fill in the gap with details, that in the human experience provides credibility. But the most important thing is nothing you do can survive this. If the audience suspects that there is a conflict of interest, you are no longer credible. What instead you create is this defensiveness in your audience because they suspect that there's a conflict of interest. So instead of being open to what you might have to say, they become very suspicious. They put up a shield, and then your information just bounces off. And this is why Rob may be the far better presenter versus an academic. Most people would trust what an academic says because he's got nothing to sell to you. That's why between a salesperson and a researcher, even the salesperson is probably 10 times more compelling presenting a slide deck and 10 times more interesting. A presentation from a researcher may actually be more successful because they feel like the researcher is less trained to lie to me versus a salesperson. So, again, and you want to understand that. And this is why the way in which we organize our sales meetings, the way in which we speak with clients, it's all related to that experience, that perception. And so, I think one point cannot be overemphasized is the compellingness of someone's ability to argue, make a point, or just how darn likable someone is, like Jeff. That is not the end-all and be-all in a presentation. A lot of that you have to understand what helps you reduce that experience of conflict of interest. If you can't break through that, there's really very little you can do to push that forward. And so, again, I'm going back to the monkey paper. I think in many ways, the way in which we couch that, it's joint work with Phil Tyndall at Towers Watson, right? We're borrowing their endorsement and credibility. We tell people we wrote this because so many consultants were interested in the difference between the smart beta, and this is the research in response to that. And we took out any hint of, product pitching, any mentioning of really RAFI, any positive way, to reduce the experience of conflict of interest. In fact, we went out of our way to say we're going to invert the fundamental index and look at the inverse of fundamental index works just as good, and it actually is only as good as a random monkey throwing darts. All of that actually was meant to reduce the experience of conflict of interest so that then the information could be received. All right. Next one, concreteness. This is really about minimizing the mental processing load required on our audience. A lot of people think that people are interested in thinking. That's just not true. People like to do as little of that as possible. And the more you require of them, the more they'll just tune you out, because that's just hard work. And we also make the mistake of thinking about if you give people information, give people sort of a logical framework to think through something, you could sort of teach them. That's actually not how human beings learn. The way we learn actually is based on what's called schema learning, meaning we spend a lot of time learning things when we're young, and that pretty much anchors our ability to understand the rest of the world. So if you didn't learn a lot when you're younger, you're kind of screwed. So schema learning, basically, we map everything else new in life to something we already know, and we hope it fits. And this is why sport analogy works really well, because most Americans play a sport, or two, or three, or four growing up, and they understand that really well. So if you can map the sport analogy, they don't have to learn something new. It just fits with a previous experience. It minimizes loading in the way they think. Now, because of that, it's really important for you to understand, what did someone grow up with? What are the schemas that make sense to them? Like, if you talk to a European and try to use baseball schema, that totally doesn't work. And I actually had that experience in graduate school. And one of our professors kept on trying to teach statistics with baseball, not realizing like 80% of the class were foreign students who've never seen a baseball game. And so that was just, and so you can understand, what's really important out of this is not just use a sport analogy. It's to understand what analogy or what schema makes sense to someone, right? So soccer, or more properly, football for Europeans probably make a lot more sense than baseball, whereas it probably wouldn't for Americans. So let me give you an example. The following, and this is actually a true research done by the Stephen Covey, who wrote the book on the 7 Habits of Successful People. What he discovers, only 40% of all American workers know the firm's mission. Only 20% know their KPI, which is their kind of key performance indicator, or like what they're supposed to be doing. That's valued. And 20% of them don't trust their boss or colleague. Now, when you look at these statistics, do you get really alarmed? Like, is that really horrible? Is that really bad? Or do you say, well, that sounds about right? You probably chuckle and say, well, I don't think this is horrible. That probably sounds what an average firm is supposed to do. So this doesn't alarm you. And of course, if I want to alarm you, I wouldn't use that because these statistics, again, people don't have a natural intuition understanding of numbers. So the way it was told by Stephen Covey was, imagine you're on a basketball team, 5 people on the court, and only 2 of you actually know what it means to win the game. Like only 2 of you have any concept that scoring more points than the other side is the measure of success. And only one on the team knows the position he's playing and which goal he's shooting at. The other 4, I might be playing center, I could be playing shooting guard, but I'm actually not terribly sure which goal I should be shooting at. And then there's one guy on the team who would never pass the ball to you because he just doesn't trust you. And so when you put it in that context, you go, well, that's really dysfunctional. So to hit the point a little bit more, numbers. We love to use numbers, but the fact of the matter is we think numbers are very concrete, but no, numbers are not concrete. Because most of us don't grow up with numbers. We grow up with experiences. We grow up with things we can watch, touch, and feel. Numbers are incredibly abstract, actually. So you've tried to compel someone into believing you by throwing numbers at them. This just doesn't work. I'll give you an example. So they put out a statistic to try to tell people, don't be afraid of sharks in the water. It's an unlikely event. You're more likely to drown than being killed by a shark by 60 to 1. How many people drown a year? I don't know. 60 to 1, that sounds like a big ratio, but and so the way someone actually told it was far more compelling. He says, you're 300 times more likely to be killed by Bambi than by a shark. And that's actually true. So essentially, that was the point that more people actually die because they run into a deer while driving than to be chewed up by a shark when swimming. And so if you can use that as an example, it becomes more visceral. Here's something else. The accuracy of a scientific equipment, it's like shooting a beam from the Earth to the sun with a dispersion of 3/4 of a mile, or one-third of a mile. And again, people have no idea how far the Earth is from the sun, but they do know a mile is pretty big, so they're probably not very impressed by a third of a mile. That's a very big margin of error, right? So you guys sort of, again, understand what do people have a natural experience for. And so you could actually change that example to, it's as accurate as you throwing a baseball from LA to New York and hitting a quarter. It's actually the same reference in terms of scale. And that's a little bit more understandable. And, like big, giant numbers. And people have no idea what a quintillion is supposed to be. 1 in 128 billion. So 1 in 128 billion. If you actually knew the odds of every NCAA basketball game and you were in the March Madness bracket, your chance of getting it all right is 1 in 128 billion. So that was kind of the Warren Buffett challenge. No idea how that's rare, but how rare is that? Well, it makes sense when you tell someone that's like winning the super lotto twice in a row. Then someone gets a sense, okay, well, that's incredibly rare. So the analogy you want to use is going to be highly dependent on who's sitting in the room. And from that perspective, if you're planning an event, sizing up a talk, it's really non-ideal for you to have a very heterogeneous audience. As much as you can avoid that, avoid having a heterogeneous audience, because if they're very heterogeneous, you can't pull it off with analogies, because everyone grows up with different analogies. A sport analogy may fall flat on 2/3 of the room. So that's just something you got to think about. And that's why preparing for a talk, really a huge part of the presentation is understanding who's going to be there and what their common denominators are. Okay, moving on. So we did simplicity, unexpectedness, credibility, concreteness, emotional. Emotional really addresses the why should I freaking care. And that's, again, equally important. Once you establish your credibility, before you're able to give concreteness and get people to listen to you, you really need to deal with why should someone care. Oftentimes we talk about you got to tell people the benefit of your presentation. So in a simple term, what's in it for me? A lot of times we go with the rational self-interest. What are the payoffs to someone who's listening to this talk? How can they use this? And so that's very useful. Except oftentimes we aim too low in the following sense. We aim too low because we tend to think of the other guy on the other side as perfectly rational. And so we think of sort of what is the rational self-interest. But what we also know is human beings actually almost have sort of two divided sort of decision-making centers. One is rational, one is emotional. In fact, again, they've done experiment with this where they're basically fundraising for a charity. And so the fundraising is to support very poor children in Africa to go to school. Now, there's a sort of gut-wrenching video that they show you. But before that, one group was told to complete very complicated mathematical calculations before they go to this fundraising event, versus a group that watched like a soft movie, and the money that they got from the two groups were night and day difference. Like, if you were just doing some very complicated calculation, your rational self-interest center takes over, and many rational self-interested people just aren't very charitable. And so again, understanding that, just realize the power of appealing to the emotional versus the rational. So the more you make a presentation that's incredibly rational, the more you just have to deal with the fact that the self-interested, rational person may be just harder to convince. And this then takes us into, in terms of self-interest, there are actually multiple levels of self-interest. It's not completely binary. And this is referred to as the Maslow's pyramid. And it's actually higher gradation than this. I summarize them as sort of the following. Most of us generally focus on the security aspect, which is physical security, financial security. And so we try to communicate to the end user, how are you going to make more money with this? How would your retirement be safer? And we don't actually appeal to the other things that are actually far more important to people who are financially secure, for people who are in the high-income, high-net-worth category. Because to them, what is actually far more important is they're at a stage in their life where it's the self-esteem, it's the public esteem that they can receive out of a particular product, or it is the knowing and understanding. At some level, we are actually far more interested in just understanding something, understanding the world, understanding our place in the world, knowing things, and of course, at the highest level, purpose. And so make sure you pay attention to that in your presentation, because those are far more likely to trigger sort of the emotional center, and oftentimes far more powerful in terms of getting a decision. And so again, I want to keep going back to this. When you have a heterogeneous audience, it's very difficult because you don't know how to sort of appeal to everyone in the context of your product, of your message. And so this is something you want to pay attention to. You want to appeal to the emotional, and then pay attention to sort of the higher level of needs as you're describing the benefit. Okay, finally, story. And this is something I used to make fun of, and now I understand the error of my way. Storytelling is incredibly powerful. A lot of us think of storytelling as, oh, you're telling a cute joke and you get a laugh. No, that's not what's actually going on. Story is the best way to avoid unnecessary resistance on the side of the audience receiving your message. And part of why a story is powerful is as you tell a story, the person on the other side naturally starts to enact the scenes in their head. And so when you tell a story of, I went somewhere, I saw this, blah, 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 the listener on the other side starts to create these imagery in their head. And that's why oftentimes what they discover is radios leave a much stronger impression than movies. Or reading a book creates a much stronger lasting impression than watching a movie, because those are media that forces your brain to have to fill in information gaps. So it actually triggers more activity, and it creates this visual enactment within your head. And the interesting benefit when you create this visual enactment that then actually creates a physical, visceral experience is they start to drop that skepticism. They don't doubt the story because they've sort of lived it, they experienced it, it becomes visceral. And so there's far less resistance in communicating that. And so this is actually just a way for you to avoid making a point by throwing statistics, by arguing a rational point, because you might even be very good at that, but it doesn't overcome the fact that the other person, in response to that, it's our natural psychology that we just become defensive when someone comes at you with numbers, comes at you with logic. We want to be skeptical. We want to not believe. We want to sort of push back. And if you tell a story which causes the person to sort of reenact that scene and they sort of live through that, they naturally want to believe it. It's a very different experience. And so that's kind of the point of the storytelling, is psychologically, we evolve in a certain way that story is a much more natural way for us to just ease into something with belief, whereas numbers and logic actually tends to create resistance. And so kind of an example that I really like was Subway, which is trying to sell this image of Subway is healthier than fast food. And they've done all sorts of marketing campaign, right? You know, like 7 subs with less than 6 grams of fat, so on and so forth. And none of that were very successful because people didn't have a, first of all, people question whether, well, really, I mean, is eating a bunch of cold-cut ham really healthy, so on and so forth. Just like you could, Subway began this arguing with people, and people just argue back. It's like, I just don't think, eating ham, sure, it's healthier than eating beef patty, but I don't think of that as healthy at all. And then what they discovered was there was actually this guy, Jared, who was grossly overweight. I think he weighed like 425 pounds in college and was probably on his way to early death. And he started to lose weight by walking, a mile and a half to a Subway sandwich shop, eat a Subway and walk back. And, over the course of 6 months, he dropped from 425 pounds down to like 250. And that became like a sensational story in a tiny local newspaper. But Subway picked up on that, and they ran this national campaign. And they said nothing about the healthiness of Subway or its ability to help you lose weight. Obviously, none of that would be FDIC approved anyways. What they ran was, hi, I'm Jared. And then the picture of Jared at 425 pounds with his pants this big. And Jared talked about he walked to Subway every day and ate a sandwich, and now he's, skinny Jared. And that story, as you participate in that, you stop arguing with Subway with, maybe it was mostly just the walking the Subway, right? I could walk the Subway and don't eat anything and come back. That'd be even better, right? And that you saw over that time period where they ran the campaign, they had a 25% sales increase over the average competitor. And so that was why, again, when we first came out with Raffi, we anchored the whole campaign around a story. And that story goes something like this. It went like, George King, who was the chairman of the Common Fund, and they were complete 100% indexed to S&P 500 because they thought low cost was going to get you good performance. And then he discovered during the tech bubble that 33% of his S&P 500 portfolios were in these stocks that feel like they're really bad stocks. Ridiculous PEs that made things that he didn't understand. And he was very troubled by it, and he wanted to find a solution, but before he could, market collapsed, Common Fund lost a lot of money, and then when he retold the story to Rob, and Rob started thinking about, well, how could we help him? How could we fix that problem? And it's that story that actually really connected with people, far more so than you go and say, well, if you think about cap weighting and prices are mean reverting, then there's a positive correlation between the weights and the overvaluation, right? That doesn't connect with people, even though that might be technically much more accurate. And so the power of a story. And so from that, what you hopefully can distill is the worst presentation you can make is one that's based on abstract argument. Because people just argue back with you abstractly. And fact of the matter, unless you're trained scientists, most of us argue very poorly using abstract language, and then it's just sort of people arguing non-constructively. Better if you can use an analogy, because it really helps people understand. Right? In a presentation, the chance of you teaching someone new is nearly zero. Right? If someone feels like you're teaching them something complex, the mind shuts off, they start playing with their iPhone. It's just not very useful. So if you can give them an analogy or an example based on something they already understand, that they can map what you're saying into that example, then they very quickly can understand that. But more powerfully, if you could actually tell a story, then it actually becomes something they sort of, reenact, and they really viscerally gets it, and they viscerally want to believe in it. And that's the most powerful. So, concluding, I think we're exactly on time. I have a copy of the book, so you can borrow that. We'll put a few more in the library. It's a wonderful book for you to sort of read. But more than anything else, what I want to communicate to you is effectiveness in presentation has nothing to do, and particularly given that a lot of my researchers are not native speakers, has nothing to do with your command of English. In fact, if you use really beautiful words and very hard words, that actually is far more counterproductive. If you come across incredibly slick, that's incredibly counterproductive. If you're just entertaining, that's entertaining, but it has no correlation to the message actually sticking and driving activities. So just accept the fact that most of us present poorly, and there's a science to effective presentation. Some of us do it intuitively without knowing it. It's because you sort of observe what has worked, what hasn't worked. But it's a very learnable skill. And you don't actually have to work very hard to learn this. And so there's a science, there's a research behind this. And I would encourage all of you to sort of approach presentation with that mindset. That is an incredibly improvable skill if you wanted to. So with that, that's what I have for today. I hope that was useful. And if there are questions, I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, we can all go back to what we were doing before. Yes, Jeff.